So I'm just saying for myself and for the sake of having a recording that I know what I'm recording. This is the week 11, the evening session of our weekly online review sessions. And I think you should be able to see my PowerPoint of the kind of weekly review slides. Excellent. So I know that there's a bit of a timeline crunch. So what I want to do, I want to go through the most important things that I want to get addressed, and then we can talk about the weekly chapter and so on. The weekly chapter really is going to be quite light, like the last week's chapter was as well. But I have a reminder about the deadlines, and can you believe next week it's going to be exam 3 and practical 3. We're already there. That's the feeling I had. I was like, how is this happening? But I realized that some students, and I'm not referring to you, I'm referring to other students as well, are still catching up on some of the work. So it might be that I'm going to end up extending the exam and practical 3 for 2 weeks. So there's time to catch up on the work before you take that exam. So I would take a breather and not worry about it. But what I do want to talk about is that many students are facing that their Connect access codes are starting to expire. Because if you received the Connect access code from the college when we moved all of a sudden fully online last spring, they are coming to the end of their lifetime. And I've got a couple of things I want to mention about that. And then I want to talk about this week's assignments, because there's a little bit of a, again, different kind of assignment setup. So those are the things that I really want to go through. And then we'll do also this week's module in terms of the topics. But that's something that you can always catch up. And I have a really good lecture video set up of that as well. But this has already changed from this morning's review session. So this is the newest information. So for last week's module, because there was a little bit of a delay with opening that, I extended the deadline for that. And then for some reason that extension didn't stick and it closed at the end of the week. So I opened it again, and now it's open for 2 more weeks from this day. So there's plenty of time, not just for last week's assignments, but for this week's assignments as well. So there's 2 weeks to get those done. And as always, if for some reason you cannot get things done by then, I'm still happy to do extensions. I'm still happy to open things. But I just want you to know that there's more time than even what I said earlier on. So I don't think the morning class actually heard about this, but you're going to be able to hear about it. And I'll make an announcement of that. I just have such a pile of things to get through that the announcement might not happen today. It might happen a day later or so on. But what I really want to mention, a couple of words about, and sorry about all the highlightings, they're from the morning session already, that the exam 3, it's coming next week, but I really think that what I'm going to do, and again, I haven't yet announced this properly for anyone until now, I think that we're going to make it available for 2 weeks. And that's same also for the practical 3. And the reason for that is that a lot of students are kind of having to do a little bit of catching up on materials. And I don't want you to have to take an exam on material that you haven't yet really studied. But I'm going to do the review sessions as I normally do on Mondays and Wednesdays next week, on morning and in the evening. And I'm happy to facilitate any other review sessions that anyone requests. There's going to be a study guide. And again, every single question is going to be from that study guide. We're going to cover 3 chapters. So the respiratory chapter, the urinaries chapter, and today's chapter or this week's chapter, which is kind of continuation of the urinary chapter. So the chapter about water, electrolytes, and pH balance. It's the same format as before. Every single question in an exam is going to be from the lecture videos, and every single question is going to be from the study guide. Study guide, I don't publish the full-on answers. They're going to be on those review sessions for the sake that then you have to kind of at least look through them. I haven't quite finalized it. I'm almost finished with writing the exam. I think it's going to be about 50 questions. So exactly like last time. Again, open book exam. So you can use any resources you wish. You can take it from home. The only thing that I gotta do, and I know that I'm gonna do it for those who have let me know, but if there is anyone, and I'm saying this for the recording, if there is anyone who has gotten an accommodation plan for double time, drop me a message if I don't send you a message first at the beginning of next week that I have set you up with the extra time. So rather than having I think it's 60 minutes, so rather there's gonna be, or whatever time it is, there's gonna be a double time for these students. Just honestly, use your notes, take your time, try to tackle all of the questions, at least guess. It's better to guess something and get points by luck than not even attempt. But like I said, there's going to be 2 weeks for this, and everything's going to be from the study guide. For the practical, it's the exact same format as last time. Again, fill in the blanks, 50 questions, 60 minutes, unless you have an accommodation plan which gives you double the time or whatever it is. Again, it's open book. You can take it from wherever you want. You can take notes. You can do whatever. I went through every single question of that practical yesterday, and there's a lot of naming organs, but there's also a lot of specific structures to be named. So it's a kind of a mix of two. If you just know the organs, you'll do okay. If you aim for an A, then also know the specific structures. I really think that those anatomy practice videos are good for that. And the key on those is, again, with the filling blanks, that don't worry about the spelling. And if you don't know an answer to what I'm asking, tell me something else so I can give you points. If nothing else, tell me something about life. But I would prefer that it relates to whatever the organ or structure or whatever I'm asking for. But there's no curveballs. It's the exact same as before. And it's going to be, again, available for 2 weeks. I just have to make that change, but I haven't yet announced it for the rest of the class, but I'll make an announcement of that. So I just want you to have the time to finish actually studying the material before you take the test. In terms of the exam 2 and practical 2, I was going to release the results for those today, but there's been a couple of other things that I had to tackle. So I'm hoping that if not by the end of today, by the end of tomorrow, I'll have them released. The big thing that I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about is that this week for the assignments, again, they're extended by 2 weeks. So there's a lots of time to do those. But there's only 3 pieces of assignment that need to be done. The Learn Smart is what you have done before, that there's questions about the chapter. If you don't know an answer, you click on that and it takes you to the textbook where it tells you the answer. So basically, as long as you work through it, you get the full points. The quiz is as quizzes before. But then you'll notice that that's all there is in terms of traditional stuff. And I don't know if you faced this in your previous courses, but every course in this college is supposed to give you a critical thinking assignment at some point of the semester. And our critical thinking assignment is going to be on this week's material. So what it means that this assignment is worth of 16 points. So it's worth of quite a chunk of points. And it's done fully through Canvas. You're not going to access it through the Connect or through the publisher's resources. It's fully through Canvas. And here's what the critical thinking is going to be about. So there's going to be 2 case studies or 2 case scenarios. And each one of them is 1 side of a page long. I looked through them, I wrote through them, I edited them a little bit. So they're not super long, but there's 2 of those. So make sure you do both. And when you enter that assignment, there's going to be a link to download the critical thinking assignment. and you download that file. It's a Word file, and in that Word file, you get told a little clinical story or details of the patient. There's, in a lot of the time, there's some sort of measurements that we've taken, and then the normal values that you should get for those measurements. And you compare that, is this patient normal for this measurement or not? And basically, that's what you do to answer to those questions on that critical thinking sheet. You look through them and you answer that, oh, this is normal, this is not normal. Once you've done that, the next step normally is that then you look at, well, what does it mean if this is not normal? What could it be? And it might be that you have to do a little bit of research outside the lecture material. So Googling, for example, hormones. What is this hormone? What does it do? And basically you either write down these things that are abnormal, or you write a couple of sentences what the clinical situation would be, or in another clinical case, you just circle, is it true or false, the statements about that patient. Things like that. It's really simple. It's really easy. And I'm quite happy to open that sheet so you can have a quick look of that, what it is going to be like. But I'm going to do it once we've finished this part, because my computer seems to be crashing today because I've got so many things going on. So when I open it, there is a chance that all of a sudden I disappear. I will come back. I will have to re-log in. But if that happens, I just want that we get through the main parts on this PowerPoint first. But I'll show you what the case studies are going to be. But basically, you fill in that case study. You can either print in the sheet and fill in by hand, or you can type into the Word document, or you can even just write your answers to the questions from the Word document to the text box within Canvas. But somehow you give me those answers. And how I'm going to grade your answers for that is by using a grading matrix. And you are going to be able to see that grading matrix even before you submit your assignment for me. So you'll be actually able to see how your points are going to be allocated. So it's worth of checking that out, either before you do the assignment or when you're ready to submit it. So this is what it's going to look on your Canvas course for this critical thinking assignment. There's going to be this spot where there's a hyperlink or a link to download a Word document. So I'm going to show you what the Word document looks like. That's one page for each case study. So you download that, then you work through it, and then you either upload the answer, upload the picture, or upload the scan of your answers, or you can even just type in the answers. And this is the grading matrix. This is part of it. I haven't taken pictures of all of it, but it's available there on your Canvas course to read before you attempt it. But it shows you how the points are going to be assigned. So an example here, we're looking at a critical thinking characteristic that's the same for all courses throughout the college, that student can apply knowledge and skills in a different context and situation or a task. So if student answers 8 or 9 correct answers to these true or false questions, they're going to get 4 points. So you can even get one of these true or false questions wrong, and you still get full points for that part of the assignment. If you answer less number of those correctly, then you get less points. But notice, as long as you've attempted, even if you don't get any of them correct, you still get 1 point. And it works through the same questions like that. There's going to be that you are expected to identify problems based on the data that you're given, that what's off from normal values. If you're able to identify right number of problems, all of them, you get full marks. But if you identify only some of these, you still get some points, as long as you give it a go. So when I grade your assignment, I basically have your assignment open on one window, and then I have this grading matrix in front of me, and I'll be clicking that, okay, they answered all the points that I wanted. And then I click that box, and then I move through this assignment like this, and computer adds up your points, and that's how you get the points for the critical thinking question. I'm gonna show you now what the critical thinking question is gonna be looking like. And I'm praying that my software doesn't crash. So I've got the assessment here. And I don't have a problem showing it. I might not give you the answers, but I definitely am super happy to show what you are asked to do. So let me just share that one. And again, there might be a little bit of delay before it shows up on your screen, but there should be a Word file that you should be able to see. So this is basically the critical thinking assignment. We start weirdly with scenario 2, but it tells you a little bit about the patient, 37-year-old man, and they come to the ER, you're working there, and you do some measurements of the patients. And there's the results of these measurements. And then we compare them to the normal ranges. So the first question that you're being asked is that you're being asked to look, what's not normal in this patient? Well, if we have a look, for example, of the heart rate of this patient, their heart rate is 140 beats per minute. Normal range for the heartbeats would be between 60 and 100. So their heart is racing faster than normal. That would be the first point that you write down there. What else can we see? Their pulse is weak. So that's not what it should be. Pulse should be regular normally. So that's the second point to write as an answer. And you work through this like that. I think that, for example, blood pressure, their blood pressure is 92/55. Well, that's a little off from what we would expect to see in a patient. So again, that's something to note. So you write what you notice on here, and then you are looking, you might have to do a little bit of Googling. What would be a situation where we see these signs and symptoms? But you will find the answer. There's nothing that you wouldn't have seen before. And then you write maybe a couple of sentences to explain what could be the cause of these symptoms that we see. For example, you'll see that the lab value for ACTH is 75, whereas it should be somewhere between 9 and 52. Well, you might not remember immediately what ACTH is. So for this question too, you have to actually find out what ACTH is. And you can find it out by Googling or whatever. The second scenario, there's true and false statements. Instead of true, we say likely true or unlikely to be true. And you pick which statement sounds right, which one doesn't sound right. And then you choose, is this patient healthily hydrated or unhealthily hydrated? And this is something that we'll talk about today. And then you write 1 to 3 sentences explaining why you decided that they're unhealthy or they're healthy. That's all there is. It sounds much scarier than it is. The critical thinking assignment, it's really straightforward. So don't let that freak you out, but I wanted to show it because it's, again, something different that we haven't seen before. It seems like we have always something different. And before I jump on to go through the chapter content for this chapter, I do want to mention a couple of words about the fact that when we moved fully online last spring, I believe that college gave most of the students the Connect access codes. Well, if you used it on the day one when you were given it, it's about now when it's gonna start expiring. Well, I realize that many students don't have the money to spare to buy a new code, but that is the college policy, that you should then buy a new code. Well, I'm trying to work with the students on this. But this is me going the extra mile. And I'm not saying this to you. I'm saying this for anyone who watches the video. So bear in mind that if you don't want to wait for me to help you out, then you just buy the new code and you'll be done with it. But what I will be doing, I will be opening all of the remaining chapters so you can work through those Connect assignments if you want to try to make most of your code before it expires. It doesn't mean that we would not still be staying to the schedule of the course material. I just want to give a chance for anyone who wants to make a start of doing those and submitting those in, that there is that option. The other thing that I'll be doing, and I won't be able to finish this until at the end of this week, I'm coming up with alternative activities. So if your code has expired and you don't want to buy the new code, there's going to be an activity that I give to you for you to do. So you can do that activity instead of doing the Connect assignments, and I'll grade that activity, and that will be what's going to count for your assignment grades. But again, this is something that is the extra step that I'm happy to do. But if you're really anxious and you can't wait for me to do that, then it's the easiest thing that you just buy the new access code. That was like in a very politically correct way, trying to make a point of that. And then at the end of the day, I'm going to mention again that you can retake assignments. I can open them, I can extend them as you want. And there's also the tutoring services available. But that's the kind of housekeeping things for this week's weekly review. Do you have any questions about that, or are we good to jump on to the key points of this chapter? I'm trying to jump from one view to another. I think that we're good to jump then to the key points of this chapter. So we're going to go through them, and we're going to go through them quickly. I have just uploaded, I see it's running on the background, PowerPoint with the voiceover for this chapter, and it goes into a little bit more detail than what we will go on this review session. But the content is essentially the same. So you should be able to see the slides that I've done. And I won't make it a big screen, just simply because otherwise it will start playing those videos that I've recorded. And I really don't want to see myself again. I see myself enough. But what we will be looking at this week's chapter is three different things. We're going to be looking at how the water is balanced within the body, how the amount of electrolytes is balanced within the body, and how the pH is balanced within the body. So this is kind of continuation of the urinary system, and it's more of physiology than anatomy. So if you are wondering about that, and if you need to go, there's going to be a recording on. So just feel free to go. But really what I want to do, I want to explain why it is important that we look at these lab reports and notice that there's different values that we expect to be normal for water amounts, electrolyte amounts, and pH values. So really being able to read those lab reports is important, because then you are able to see if you see what's normal and what's not normal in your patient. So when we start talking about, as the first thing, about the body fluids, I want to go all the way back to your chapter where you discussed about properties of water in your introductory bio courses. So that's when you noticed that water was essential for life. We find that all living things, most of the living things evolved in water, all living things contain a lot of water, and when we go to the space, we look for signs of water, either as evidence that there has been life or there's currently life. Well, this applies also to humans. About 65 to 75% of us is simply water. And the amount of water varies a little bit based on your age, based on your sex, based on your body build, and so on and so on. But it's roughly somewhere between 65 and 75% of your body that's made of water. So managing that water in your body is going to be important. And what we notice that most of that water is going to be inside the cells. It's going to be intracellular fluid. So about 2/3 of the water in your body is inside the cells. And the remaining 1/3 is actually outside the cells. So it's called extracellular fluid. And this can be, for example, the interstitial fluid, but also your blood the plasma in your blood, and also the lymph, which was the part of the liquids that leaked out of the cardiovascular system. So really what we notice is that most of the water in your body, from that 65 to 75%, is within the cells, and 1/3 is outside the cells. Well, this is going to be something that we'll have a look, and I have an explanation why this could be important, and I've explained a little bit about the research that I do for a living, where I'm looking about the amount of water inside the cell and outside the cells, and how it can tell us whether it's worth saving someone's heart muscle or if that heart muscle is already dead. So you can find all that in the actual lecture video if you look at it in full. The next section that I have for this chapter should be revision, again from your intro bio courses. I've listed key characteristics of water that make water so important for us. Well, the first thing that we notice is that water is a great transportation media. So a lot of things can be transported in water. And in terms of the human body, we see that most of the blood was made of water. So a lot of stuff can be put into the blood because the water in the blood transports it from one part of the body to another part of the body. It could be, for example, gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. It could be our nutrients, it could be our energy, it could be our waste products, it could be hormones. So water is great at transporting stuff. And it's not just within the animals, but it's also within the plants. So plants rely on this water to transport the nutrients from the soil to the leaves where the photosynthesis happens. So that's the first characteristic of water that makes water so important for us. The second and third characteristics, I'm presenting them as a bundle. These are cohesion and adhesion. And sometimes students struggle a little bit kind of noticing what's the difference between these two. So that's the reason why I want to tackle them together. So cohesion refers to the binding of water molecules to other water molecules. So it's how the water molecules stick together to other of the same kind, other water molecules. Whereas adhesion refers to these water molecules sticking to other surfaces, so to any polar surfaces. So these two are important characteristics of the water. This is why water molecules, water droplets stay together. They don't disperse into millions of pieces, but also this is why the water droplets stay within surfaces such as in this on the spider web. They don't fall off from that because of the adhesion. Then the next one that I wanted to mention was the surface tension. Well, surface tension is what allows these bugs to walk on water. And this is again thanks to the cohesion of the water. So it forms kind of this rubbery surface. As long as your weight is not too much, you will not break that cohesion of the water surface. So surface tension is one important characteristic of the water. We also notice that water works as a great heat reservoir. So if you live on the coastal area, for example, by the sea or by a big lake, you'll notice that the climate stays fairly regular. There's very little changes from during the day. The water binds the extra heat so it doesn't get too hot. And during the night, the water slowly releases the heat so that it doesn't get too cold. So water allows you to even out the changes in the temperature. And a good example of that would be, for example, in our body, that the amount of the water, the 65 to 75% of the water, that makes sure that our body temperature remains fairly constant. Water also can take 3 different phases, or I think that there's a 4th, but we're going to talk about 3. Water can be vapor. So steam, water can be the liquid that we know, or water can be solid ice. But what's really important with these phases is that as we move from one phase to another, the distances between these water molecules change. So that's one of the characteristics of water that we need to be aware of. And finally, water is an amazing solvent. Most things dissolve in water. And because most things can dissolve in water, water can carry many solutes in it. And because water can carry solutes, it is a great transport media because things dissolve in it. So you see how these two things are connected. There's a bunch of molecules that do not dissolve in water. Well, we're not going to be very interested about these on this lecture or on this chapter. They're not really significant to us. What we are interested are the elements that dissolve to water or molecules that dissolve to water. As they dissolve to water, we'll notice that they build up or they end up with a charge of some kind. So you'll see all these pluses and you'll see all of these minuses. That's the characteristic of water in terms of building up a charge. And these charges are going to become important for us. And we'll have a look at that in a second. We'll end up finding a lot of these charged elements or charged molecules in blood, in interstitial fluid, and in intracellular fluid. So in all parts where you find water or fluids in your body, we end up finding these. And I will go through a couple of examples of those in the actual lecture video, but for our purposes, what we really want to take away as the take-home message is that as water moves from one body compartment to another, also the electrolytes that are dissolved in water, so all these elements with charges in them, they tend to move with the water as well. So that's something worth noticing. And that's the kind of two-thirds big take-home messages from this chapter. The third one that I want us to focus on is the fact that we take in water and we put out water. So how much should you drink in a day? You should drink about 2.5 liters. Of course, it varies based on the size of you, it varies based on other factors, but roughly somewhere like that. But the amount of water that you take in is equal to the amount of water that you put out. So we have the homeostasis. You take the same amount of water as you put out, your body remains in normal. You don't gain extra water, you don't lose water. That's the ideal situation and what we try to preserve. Well, how do you get water in your body? Well, the biggest driving force for getting water into your body is the sense of thirst. So you end up drinking. About 2/3 of the water that you get into your body is due to drinking. You get some water also from the food, that's liquid food or moist food, and a little bit of it comes also from metabolism. And if this is something that makes you wonder that what is he talking about, remember, for example, this formula that I've shown here, how glucose is broken down into energy, and as a byproduct of that, we end up with water. So we end up producing water in most chemical reactions in the body. But the drinking was the biggest way of getting water into. Well, the biggest way of getting rid of the water is through urination. So we pee out most of the water. Again, about 2/3 of the water content. Rest of this 1/3 is we get rid of water through evaporation and sweat, through the skin, and also through breathing some of the humidity out. A little bit also in feces, but the amount of water lost in feces is actually very small. And you'll see why when we talk about the large intestines, how they recover the water from the feces before they're eliminated in the next chapter, right? But you'll notice that the main way of getting rid of water is through urinating, through pee. Then your textbook goes through a concept of osmoreceptor ADH mechanism. There's many different kinds of graphs, a little bit depending on textbook, depending on how much detail we go, but we can do better than this. We're gonna go through these processes by referring back to our good old friend homeostasis. So homeostasis was all about maintaining consistent internal environment. And we had this loop diagram where we have a stimulus, something changes in the body. This is picked up by a sensor. Well, sensor notices that something's picked up, but the actual processing of this information is done at the control center, which was usually our brain. We have a set point of what we expect it to be, but if it deviates from the set point, we start acting on this through an effector. And normally, we stop the stimulus from happening. So most of the time, it's negative feedback in this homeostatic mechanism that we have. A few exceptions where we see positive feedback: childbirth, lactation, and blood clotting. Those are the only examples that I can think of. So this is the homeostatic feedback mechanism loop. And this is something that I keep repeating and repeating because it is so important. We're going to be referring to this time and time again. And one way we refer to this is how we look at how water balance is regulated in the body. So let's say that we have this case where there's too much water, so your blood becomes too watery. Well, this is sensed within the osmoreceptors at the hypothalamus. Well, this part sends a message to the control center, our brain, where we make a command to the effector, and the effector in this case is going to be our pituitary gland. Pituitary gland starts to secrete less ADH. And you remember the function of the ADH was to be anti-diuretic hormone, so it makes us pee less. Well, if we make less of ADH, now we actually start to produce more urine, because at the distal convoluted tubule, the wall becomes permeable if we have ADH, but now we don't have as much ADH, so we make more pee, so we end up urinating the excess water, and we get to an amount of water that's what we want it to be. That's one example of how this homeostatic mechanism works. But let's have a look at the opposite. When you have too little water in your body, your blood is too salty, if you wish. Well, again, this is noticed by the osmoreceptors at the hypothalamus, processed within the brain, and the effector is going to be, again, our pituitary gland. This time, because we have too little water. I don't know why this jumped here, but we have too little water. As a result of that, now your pituitary makes more ADH, which means that we take back a lot of the water at the distal convoluted tubule, and we make less pee. So that's it. So that's the couple of most important concepts. The next important concept in this chapter is going to be the tonicity of the cells. So we can have different kinds of tonicities, but all of these are based on the concept of diffusion, where substances move from areas of high concentration to areas of low concentrations until the concentrations were even. And I have a very good example of this. Look at this glass of water where we have a drop of food coloring in one. Well, what happens thanks to diffusion? From area of high concentration, it spreads to areas of low concentration until the concentration is even throughout the water. So this is the basic concept behind the tonicity. And let's have a look at 3 different kinds of tonicities. And again, these should be reviewed. If they're not, I have a really good video about actually from my classroom at the end of, or as a link from our lecture video this week. And we're first going to look at hypotonic cells. In these hypotonic cells, the insides of the cell are more salty. There's more electrolytes there than there is elsewhere around the cell. Well, as a consequence, we try to even out the concentrations, so water starts flowing into the cell. When water starts flowing into the cell grows inside and it swells. It might even burst if too much water flows in. The way I remember hypotonic, again, always try to relate it to something that you can remember. Hypotonic sounds a little bit like a hippo. And hippos are these big, swollen animals. So my hypotonic cells, so hippo cells, are swollen cells. Water is going inside. That's how I remember hypotonic cells. Next, let's have a look at isotonic cells. In isotonic cells, we have the same amount of salts both inside and outside the cell, so there's no difference on either side. So some water comes in, some water leaves, but the net amount of water remains the same. So we don't lose water, we don't gain water. The amount of water within the cell remains the same. So how I remember this is that I think of the isotonic, sounds to me a little bit like iso-perfect. Well, if you are so perfect, you don't need to change. So my isotonic cells remain the same. They don't gain water, they don't lose water, they don't grow, they don't shrink. They're perfect as they are. And final one for us to have a look of is our hypertonic cells. In hypertonic cells, the outside of the cell is more salty than the inside of the cell. And as a result, water starts flowing out from the cell. And as water flows out from the cell shrinks, and it might even end up eventually drying up. Well, how I remember hypertonic cells is that I think of people who are hyper. They have a lot of energy. People who have a lot of energy, they tend to run around a lot. People who tend to run around a lot, they become very skinny. So hypertonic cells are our skinny cells. They shrink, dry up over time. So that's my way of remembering the different tonicities. And just as a review, hypotonic cells are hippo cells. They're big, swollen ones. Water flows inside. Isotonic cells, iso-perfect, they're perfect, they don't need to change, they remain the same. They don't gain size, they don't lose size. And hypertonic cells are hyper cells, were active, they became skinny because they were so active. So they end up shrinking as water flows out of them. So I hope that helps you to remember the concept of tonicity. And there's some clinical relevance that we can think of that, for example, after you've exercised a lot and you sweated a lot and you drink water, you get a craving for salts. This is the lack of those salts in your body, and your body tries to fix that. Similarly, if you drink too much water, pure water, in a very short period of time and you don't urinate, you don't let your body to get rid of it, you can actually end up poisoning yourself, and you can even die out of drinking too much water. And this is actually what happened in one radio station competition, and I've told this full story in the full lecture video. Well, the clinical relevance, again, if we think of that, it reminds us that we need to drink these drinks that are sometimes called recovery drinks or electrolyte drinks. In these, we don't just have water or the fluid. In these, we also have these electrolytes that your body loses as you sweat. So you replace those electrolytes. In addition, having those electrolytes helps us to uptake that water into your body. And there's different kinds of energy, these drinks, recovery drinks, Gatorade, Powerade, and so on. You can look at, I've provided a list of what electrolytes each one contains and how much. So you can compare which one is really good, which one is not. And the last concept for our chapter this week is all about the pH scale. So this should be revision again. Our pH scale ran from 0 to 14, 7 being the neutral. And what pH scale did, if we had a pH that was above 7, it was alkaline or basic. And if it was below 7, it was acid. And what these numbers tell us, they actually tell us the number or concentration of hydrogen ions in the liquid. So we look at, do we have a lot of hydrogen atoms or ions or little? And this is really important for us because having a body pH that's maintained within this normal range, which is really narrow, between 7.35 and 7.45. That's not a lot of variation. Having that kind of body pH is where most reactions in your body can happen. If it's way off from that, then these chemical reactions don't happen and we have issues with your body. So we can have situations where we have too high pH or too low pH. And we'll have a look at those in a bit. But before we do, I want to show, sometimes I hear people talking about alkaline diet. diets. So where you eat food, and these diets claim that that will change your body pH. Well, it's not gonna change. Your body pH is always maintained within this narrow range from 7.35 to 7.45. And that is a really narrow range. What these diets actually do is that these substances that are of a certain kind of pH, these foods are just better for you. But it's not changing your body pH. They just happen to be good foods to eat. So there's 3 ways how we maintain our pH in the body. And we're going to go through those. And this is really one of the very last concepts on this chapter. Well, first one, which is quick acting, almost immediate effect, is the buffers. These are chemicals that bind into substances that are either acidic or basic and kind of even them out, stop them from changing your body pH. So they are quickly acting chemical substances. And in your introductory bio, you should have talked about buffers. I do experiments with my students with different kinds of substances, and we look at what are good buffers, what are not. Is yeast a good buffer? Is calcium tablets good buffer? Is sand a good buffer? Is milk good buffer? And we kind of look at what helps you to maintain your body pH on a regular basis. The second way of dealing with the changes in pH, which takes minutes to act, so a little bit slower, is through respiration. So we breathe out if the pH is not correct. We get rid of those hydrogen ions through that, or carbon dioxide through that. And the slowest method of acting, which can take hours or even days to act, is our renals, or our kidneys. And we just had a look at those. So these are responsible for eliminating these hydrogen atoms. And we can have a situation where we have too acidic or too alkaline body. And this has many different kinds of symptoms and things that we see as a result of those. And you can study those from the lecture video. The final thing that I have on this chapter as to study is to notice that fluid therapy is when we administer extra fluids. For example, if there's a fluid loss, blood loss, or other reason why there's not enough fluids in the body. And this fluid is not just any water. It includes the right amount of electrolytes, the right amount of salts, and it is also sterile. So these fluids need to be specific kinds. So this is the review of the chapter material for here. I'm going to stop sharing it, and I'm going to pause our recording just for a second. So we're back from our paused recording. Sorry about that. And what I want to do for the remaining of this session is to jump back to our weekly review PowerPoint. So let me share that with you. And let's jump there. Perfect. You should be able to see the review PowerPoint for this week's material. And as we noticed, we've now gone through this week's lecture material, the key points. The final things that I have to remind you is remember to connect access codes. You can start to expect, if they were given by the college for you, that they will slowly start to run out. You can buy a new one, or if you're patient, I will try to come up with alternative activities. I'll also try to open as many weekly modules as I can ahead of the time so you can work on those if you want to make most of your Connect code before it runs out. You can always retake assignments, have extensions, just message me with specific details. And remember that the college offered also tutoring, and I'm happy to tutor as well. And really the big point for this week is that remember all of the deadlines for last week's assignments and this week's assignments have been extended by further 2 weeks. And if you need more time, you let me know. And next week, we have exam 3 and practical 2. I'm going to extend them for 2 weeks, so you have enough time to catch up with the material and then take the test. Both of them are in the same format as before. Remember, open book, use your notes, be strategic. And for this week's assignments, remember the critical thinking that was fully completed in Canvas. You download the file and you answer the questions on that, and then you submit your file back, or you submit your written answer as text. And I will then grade it based on the grading matrix, which you can actually see before I start grading you. So make use of that. That might be helpful for you. And that's really all that I had for this week's review session. We did some questions and answers before the recording started. Most of the questions that I've received this week have been about this critical thinking assignment. We already talked about it. If you have more questions, you can always contact me. Don't stress about it. It's much more easier than you actually think. And as we can look from here, we've covered everything that we set out to do for this week's review session. So that's all I have. And it looks like this time I managed to do this without crashing our presentation, which is great news for me and in my view. So I'm gonna stop sharing the presentation now, and I'm gonna thank anyone who watches this recording. And I hope you have a good week. Remember, I'm here to help. And that's it for this week's material. We're going to wrap it up here. And I hope you have all a very good rest of the week.